Welcome back. Now we've added the animals asset pack to our project, which contains a bird. And we're going to use this bird for our bird pawn class. Now we know about meshes, and the static mesh component allows us to add meshes to our actors. But as we saw in our asset pack, we have some bird animations as well. Now, static meshes cannot be animated. That's why they're called static meshes. They remain static or still. But there does exist a type of mesh that can animate. It's called a skeletal mesh component. Now, we know about the UObject type, and we know that uScene component is derived from it. And we saw that the static mesh component is also derived from uScene component, but so is the skeletal mesh component. uSkeletal mesh component inherits the properties from uScene component, but it has additional capabilities. The uSkeletal mesh component class has its own variable called skeletal mesh. So much like the static mesh component has its own static mesh variable, the skeletal mesh component has its own skeletal mesh variable. And a skeletal mesh has a skeleton, and because it has a skeleton, it can be animated. So let's take a look at our bird skeletal mesh from our asset pack and see how the skeleton looks in the Unreal Engine editor. So we'll go back to our content folder, and we have our animal variety pack, inside of which we have the crow folder, and in the crow folder we have meshes, and here's an asset called skcrow. Now you'll see SK, which is short for skeletal mesh. Sometimes you'll see SKM, and in the pop-up, we see lots of information about this asset. Now we can double-click this, and now we're looking at this bird skeletal mesh in the skeletal mesh editor. So this is similar to the static mesh editor, except it has some additional things here. It has asset details, showing us the material it's using, as well as other information, including a skeleton. Now, just beside the Asset Details tab, we have a skeleton tree, and this is showing us a hierarchy of bones in our skeleton. Now, we can't see the skeleton, at least not by default, but if we go up to the top and click on Character, under Bones, we have the ability to show the entire hierarchy of bones. If we select that, now we can see the bones in the skeleton. Now, bones in a skeleton are weight painted to the mesh. What that means is that when one of these bones moves, the mesh will warp and move along with it. And we can click on some of these bones and move them. For example, if I click on this bone, which is called Crow L forearm, I can rotate it and the wing will rotate with it. That's because the mesh is weight painted so that the vertices on the mesh polygons follow along with the bone. Now, this is something that's done in an art program, such as Maya or Blender. And the process of adding a skeleton to a mesh and weight painting the mesh to the bones is known as rigging. So riggers create skeletons for meshes and enable those meshes to morph and animate along with the bones. And animations are assets that contain data pertaining to the movement of bones. Now, each bone changes the mesh in a different way. This bone wing left A, for example, is only weight painted to a small section of the mesh. So weight painting is something that requires a great deal of fine-tuning. I'm going to go ahead and click Character and go back to Bones and set this to Selected Only. And that way, we can select a single bone at a time and we'll only see that given bone. So since we know that our skeletal mesh has a skeleton, and if that skeleton moves, then parts of the mesh move along with it, we know that this mesh can be animated. And we've already seen some of the animations. Let's go ahead and close out of the skeletal mesh editor and go up one level into the crow folder and into animations. These are animation assets. These contain movement information for those bones. So we can double click on one. I'm going to double click on Idle Look Around. And here we can see down at the bottom, there's a timeline. And as it's scrubbing from left to right, the mesh is actually animating. And we can stop this animation at any one of these frames and scrub through and see what the animation looks like at those particular frames. So this is how animation assets work. And this animation is associated with this specific mesh only. And at the top right of this animation editor, we have other icons that allow us to go to the skeletal mesh or the skeleton straight from here. If we click on this icon here that says SK Crow, we go back to the skeletal mesh editor. And if we click on this icon that looks like a skeleton, well, now we're just looking at the skeleton in the skeleton editor. It looks a lot like the skeletal mesh editor, as we can see the mesh associated with this skeleton, and that's because in the preview scene settings panel, there's a preview mesh set for this skeleton. Now, if we had other skeletal meshes that share this skeleton, we could change this to a different skeletal mesh as long as it shares the same skeleton. But in this project, we just have this one bird skeletal mesh using this skeleton. So now that we know about skeletal meshes, we'd like to add a component to our bird pawn of type useSkeletalMeshComponent. So let's hop back into Visual Studio and we'll go ahead and do that. Now, we're going to need to forward declare this type, and we'll do that up here at the top with our other forward declarations. So we'll say class useSkeletalMeshComponent. And now we can use this type here. So let's add a variable. We'll go all the way down to our private section, and we'll declare a pointer of type useSkeletalMeshComponent. So this is a pointer, and we'll call this birdMesh. And I'd like to make this visible anywhere, so we can see it in the components panel in our bird blueprint. Now, again, this is just a pointer. It's not initialized to anything. We have to actually create the default subobject. So we'll go back to bird.cpp, and here we'll create our skeletal mesh component. Now, because we're actually going to create one, we need the header file for this type. So this brings us back to our documentation. I'm going to search the documentation for useSkeletalMeshComponent. And here's useSkeletalMeshComponent. Now, if you like, go ahead and scrub through and look at the variables and functions that belong to this class. What I'm interested in for now is the include. So I'm going to copy that include, and go back into Visual Studio and paste it just under our include for capsule component. Now we can create this default subobject. So let's do it. Down at the bottom of our constructor, we'll say birdMesh equals, and we'll use create default subobject. And I'm going to hit down on my keyboard to highlight the function that Visual Studio's IntelliSense is showing me. That way, if I hit enter, it'll auto-complete that for me. Now, the template type that we should provide is going to be useSkeletalMeshComponent, and wrapped in the text macro, we'll give it the internal name Unreal Engine will use for this, and we'll use birdMesh. Now, we've added a skeletal mesh component. We know that this class derives from scene component, so it supports attachment, and we should attach this to our root component. That way, if the root component moves, our birdMesh will move along with it. So we need to set up the attachment for our birdMesh. And to do that, we use a function that exists on scene components that allow us to attach it to other scene components. So we're going to take birdMesh, use the arrow operator, and type setupAttachment. This is the function we can use to attach this skeletal mesh component to our root component. So setupAttachment requires an input parameter of type uSceneComponent. Now, we know that root component is protected, so we can access it from child classes, such as bird.cpp, so we can use root component, or we could use capsule, as we know the capsule is the root component, or we could use the public getter function getRootComponent. All of these do the same thing. Now we know there's a second input parameter. This is of type fname, and it allows us to specify a socket name. Now we haven't learned about sockets yet. We will very soon. But scene components can have sockets, and if we specified the name of a socket, setupAttachment would then set up our birdMesh to be attached to that socket. But we haven't set up any sockets, and we see that the default value for this input is nameNone, which is a variable of type fname used to specify that we're not attaching to any given socket. So we can leave that input parameter out of it and just pass in the one required input, which is the component to attach to. So now our birdMesh is set up to be attached to the root component, which is our capsule. So let's click Save All and hop back in the editor. And I'm going to close out of the skeleton editor and the skeletal mesh editor, as well as this animation asset. And here I'm going to hot reload. Now that hot reloading is finished, I can close live coding and hop back into BP Bird. And just under the capsule component, we see that we have Bird Mesh. Now we can select Bird Mesh and see its properties in the Details panel. And the most important is our Skeletal Mesh variable. By default, it's set to none, of course, but we can change that. And if we click the dropdown, we see all the skeletal meshes in our project, including SK Crow. I'm going to select SK Crow, and now we see our mesh here. Isn't that awesome? So our BP bird now actually looks like a bird. Now, it's facing the Y direction by default, and the actor itself has its X direction pointed to the right, and we consider the X direction to be the forward direction, so we want our bird facing forward. So I'm going to click on this icon to enter rotation mode, and I have snapping enabled for rotation, so I'm going to go ahead and rotate to the right by 90 degrees, just to make sure my bird is facing forward. Now it's also raised up a little too high, so the capsule is not really in the right spot for it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit W to get my translation gizmo and move down. Now I do have snapping enabled for translation, but I can disable that to get more fine-tuned control here. And now our bird has its collision. Now the wings are outside of the collision volume. That's okay. We could either make the capsule a little bit fatter by increasing the capsule radius, but I'm okay with the capsule being like this, as the wings are going to be fluttering and objects tend to pass through feathers anyway, so I'm fine with this. So now our pawn has a mesh. I'm going to compile and save, and back here in the level editor, we can drag in an instance of this blueprint. Let's go to Blueprints, Pawns. Here's our BP bird, and I can drag it out into the level just like that. And I'm going to move it out in front of our player start so that when I hit play, I could see the bird there. Now, by default, we're not going to control the bird and move it around. We have to set all that up. We know that this bird is a pawn, which means we can move it. It can take input once we set that up. And that's going to be what we do next in the following videos. But for now, we're making progress. Our bird actually has a bird mesh. Now, before we wrap up, I'm going to show you something really cool. Back in BP Bird, we can select our bird mesh. And the Details panel has an animation section. The static mesh component class doesn't have this. That's because static meshes can't be animated, but skeletal meshes can. Now we have here animation mode with a dropdown. It's by default set to use animation blueprint. And we'll learn about animation blueprints soon enough, but we don't have an animation blueprint for this skeletal mesh. But instead, we can click the dropdown and select Use Animation Asset. And when we do that, we now have a new variable exposed called anim to play. And notice the green line here. You might recall that those animation assets we looked at earlier had the green line, as these types are color-coded. If we go back to Animal Variety Pack Crow Animations, look at that green line on these assets. That's because this shade of green represents the animation sequence type. So that's the type for these animation assets. They're animation sequences. So in BP Bird, we can choose an animation sequence for our anim to play. And if we click the drop down, I'm going to search for fly, and I'm going to choose anim crow fly. And look at that. Our animation is playing. Our bird is flapping its wings. So we can compile and save that. And back in the editor, if we go ahead and hit play, we see that our bird is actually flapping its wings. It's animated. That's because we set its anim to play to that animation sequence. Awesome. In the videos to come, we'll be setting up the ability to control this bird and fly it around and get a sort of bird's eye view of the levels that we've created. Excellent job. I'll see you in the next video.